Welcome to another episode of the BS Podcast, the show that looks at how behavioural change insights are being applied in the wild. Episodes feature renowned behavioural experts across industries and organisations, from management and marketing to policy and public health, and more. Let's dive in and see what all the BS is about. Here's your host from The Behaviourist, Nick Hobson.
Rimma Teper is an applied behavioral scientist and social psychologist. After completing her PhD, she became the resident behavioral scientist at Idea Couture. There, she helped build the behavioral science team from the ground up, working on consumer research projects with key clients including Samsung, United Way, Kroger, and more. After, she moved to Research Strategy Group as VP of Client Strategy and Behavioral Science, where she led a team in the application of BS throughout all research, from foundational ethnography to quantitative testing, all the way through to strategic solutioning. Most recently, Rimma has moved into her current role in the financial services at the Royal Bank of Canada, or RBC, as Senior Director of Behavioral Science Internal Audit. In this newly created role, she brings a behavioral science lens to the bank's assessment of risk culture and conduct. Her goal is to act as a strategic partner to the various functions and lines of business by providing insights into the psychological and systematic factors affecting decision-making within their teams. Rimma did her master's and PhD at the University of Toronto, where she happens to still lecture, and a postdoc at Rotman School of Management and Yale School of Management. So, Rimma, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
So this is a special treat for me to be, quote unquote, sitting down with you. To all my listeners who are tuning in, Rimma and I go quite a ways back. She and I were actually lab mates in grad school. What that means is we shared the same academic mentor or academic advisor, Mickey Inslicht. Hello, Mickey, if you're listening. And we completed our masters and PhDs in the same program at U of T, the same lab, which I don't even know, what was it called? Social Laboratory for Social Neuroscience, I think.
Toronto Laboratory. There's Toronto somewhere in there.
Was there? Yeah. Mickey should really come up with a fun, like, cutesy acronym. Yeah. That's what everyone does, right, in academia.
Exactly.
But I came in and you were you always were a few years ahead, my seniors. So when I started, I came in as this really nervous and neurotic master student. I always saw you and, there's a few other students, Jenny and Shauna and Alexa, as these like seasoned PhD researchers who had their shit together. And I was just sort of following in your guys' footsteps. So I've always been a fan, always admired your research. And it's great to be chatting again. So let's start. It's because we have similar paths. I think you quote unquote left academia.
I sold my soul.
What's that?
I sold my soul.
You sold my soul, yeah. And you were the first to sell out. You were the first to sell out, and so you made it that much easier for me. And we say that in jest now, especially like it's hilarious and it's funny, but at the time, I think that's the sort of attitude, that's the collective attitude of graduate students or faculty or fellow within an institution, within university, when you hear somebody who's quote unquote leaving to industry, whatever that means.
Yeah.
But I the more people I talk to who are doing similar things and making similar decisions, I think that stigma is changing and I think it's about time that it does.
Absolutely.
So if you can walk us through what that was like when you made that decision and what your sort of decision process was at that time. And I'm sure with all the hindsight bias, you can probably tell us it was all perfectly planned and easy to do. And it was totally strategic. But of course, if we can have real talk and you can really tell us what it was like to navigate that point in your life.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting that you say hindsight bias, because I think that I'm always I'm very aware of the decision-making process that led me to leave academia. I think that for a while, I sort of hid that from my employers, because you never want to say that, oh, it was my dream to be an academic and I'm just here now because I have to be. I think I've become more honest with it now. And when I talk to people outside of academia. But you're absolutely right. There was a really big stigma in academia at the time. When you left, it did sort of feel like you were abandoning this cult almost. Not to make it not to make it sound like a negative thing, but that's really what it was like. For me, to be perfectly honest, it just came to a matter of lifestyle and my life decisions, where I realized that I didn't want to be doing postdoc after postdoc until I eventually got a job in Toronto, and I had to stay local. And so I started looking for jobs outside of academia. There was quite an intense grieving process, I would say, for me, that was involved with the knowledge that I would no longer be pursuing this academic path that for many years I thought was somehow all going to work out for me. But once I kind of went through that and I started looking for jobs outside of academia, I started to really find value in some of the challenges that I was doing in my work outside of academia. So when I started looking for jobs, there wasn't such a job as a behavioral scientist or a behavioral economist. Right now, if you look on LinkedIn, you can find so many of those. That wasn't the case back in the day, back in my day.
Yeah.
I'm dating myself. So I had to look for jobs that had these keywords and skills that I possess. So it was very much looking for jobs that required some sort of quantitative research skill or statistical acumen. So that was what I was looking for keywords that were related to psychology, but it was very much a laborious process. And eventually I found this job posting for a quantitative researcher at Idea Couture. I applied and I got the job. And they brought me in because they wanted somebody purely to analyze data and to put numbers behind their research findings. At the time, the firm did a lot of qualitative research. They had a lot of PhD anthropologists actually that did this really fascinating qualitative research, these ethnographies and immersions. And they realized, after a few years of doing that some clients actually want numbers behind the research. So that's why they were looking for this quant researcher. And when I came in, I said, hey, I can do the quant, I can create some surveys for you and all of that and do some A/B testing. But by the way, I also have a PhD in psychology. And if you're all about human-centric design, I think we can really use that here. So long story short, they were very open to it. And I ended up building this behavioral science research offering with a colleague of mine who was then hired a few months after me, who also has a PhD in social psych. And we kind of built it together from the ground up. And that was pretty fun. And so, with time, the appetite within the business world for behavioral science was slowly growing. And that's when I was able to more easily find a job several years later at Research Strategy Group and then, eventually RBC, that actually ended up reaching out to me because I was a behavioral scientist. That would have never happened, 5 years ago when I was just leaving academia.
So that's what really amazes me as I've been, tracking this growth of, the behavioral science, behavioral economics, whatever we want to call it. It's only been really 5 years, right? Because I was going to ask you, was it 5 years ago when you defended and went on the job market?
Yeah. So it was
2015,
2016, actually. So less than 5 years. So it's really not been that long at all. And it is amazing. You're absolutely right. It's just this boom all of a sudden that's happened. And now behavioral science is the new hot thing that everybody wants. And I mean, it's great. Thank God everything worked out for me. And it seems to be working out for you and a lot of other people that have made that jump. But, 5-6 years ago, it was not this easy at all.
No. And I think that's that was part of the stigma of people who were sort of like leaving academia, was like, well, what are you going to do? Like, like people would laugh at you, right? From the side of the cult of the academy.
100%. And I remember saying that, I don't like, my perception while I was still in grad school was like, I don't want to just be running stats for the government, because I knew that the government, like for some reason, I had this perception that the government hires people with a PhD in psychology and they just end up running stats for them. And for me, that was like, oh my God, I just don't want to end up doing that.
No offense to those,
No
those
offense.
policy people who
Sure.
are doing that.
Yeah.
But you're right. And it's so exciting. Obviously that there's this demand in the market for our skill set. And just yesterday or the day before, was it, you found you had posted this was it a Bloomberg article?
Yeah.
So can you tell the listeners what that article was all about and why we're so excited about it?
So to be perfectly honest, it was a very, very short article. It just summed up some of the top jobs for 2020. And the headline of the article was actually the top jobs for 2020 are behavioral scientists and data analysts. So data analyst, I think, very obvious. I think we could have all predicted that. But behavioral scientist, that for me was, a really, really pleasant surprise, and also amazing that, people are actually making these predictions. We've been noticing the trends, as you just mentioned, on the sidelines through LinkedIn and the kinds of things that are being put out there and posted. But the fact that it's being picked up on this level, to me, was amazing. And it gives so much more opportunity for people with this educational background. And it gives them a lot of flexibility in terms of what kind of career they want to pursue.
Mm-hmm. Now, what I find odd, though, is that I'll go back into, because, both you and I still have sort of a foot or maybe a toe in the world of academia, because it's almost as if we're like, yeah, we're doing our thing, but we don't want to totally give it up just yet.
I know. It's like
So we do that. And when I go back into that world every so often and have conversations with, it might be a postdoc, a faculty member, or even like a grad student, the what we're talking about right here, and this sort of this optimism and this good news for the next 2020 for behavioral scientists in industry, that attitude or that positivity isn't in a lot of academic circles. And I wonder what it's going to take. So if we go back, and I know that that's dependent on the school and the institution, because there's a lot of great, for instance, programs in the UK where that's their sole focus, is to train applied focused behavioral scientists. But if you go to your R1 traditional Harvards and Yale schools, Yale or Ivy League schools, and including University of Toronto, if we sort of categorize them in there, that sense of positivity isn't there. And I wonder if there's a reason for that, because again, they want to train academics. They want to train PhD students who are going to stay within academia as opposed to do what we did, which is leave. I don't know if you have any thoughts around that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting that you bring that up. And I've definitely witnessed some, in my academic years, some advisors that were a lot more open to having their students leave academia and go to work at places like Facebook and on, right? So it really, I think, depends, and it differs on a person by person level. But I think that this is a fundamental human phenomenon. And I don't think it's like, I think that we're focusing on academia, but at the end of the day, we know that we make hiring decisions. We like to think that we make them rationally, but oftentimes we hire people that are like us. So we want people to be like us. So if I'm an academic and if I, am at Harvard or whatnot, I'm going to want to have a graduate student that has those same values and that also wants to be an academic. I don't necessarily think that that's the best way to go about it. At the end of the day, if you have somebody that's dedicated and doing high quality research while they're under your supervision, it shouldn't necessarily matter where they go afterwards. But as we know, from a behavioral science perspective, people aren't always rational. And we have these needs to surround ourselves with people that are similar to us. So I think that might be part of what's explaining it.
Well, lest we go on and rant about our our past experiences. I have, and I'm glad it's ending. It's ending on a good note for us. So there you go, Mickey. Um, but just to go back once more, revisiting our past, I'm gonna throw a question at you, and we can. This is a challenge for both of us. As I was preparing for our conversation earlier today, it dawned on me that we sort of worked together on stuff, but we really had one dedicated project in the lab, a study that we ran, an experiment. If you remember, it was a sort of a pretty big psychophys study. So my challenge is for us to do. What were we testing?
I have
What were
no
our
idea what you're
hypotheses?
talking about. I'm like,
Yes.
oh my God. I
Yeah. So I'm really putting you on the spot.
remember.
So we did a psychophys, and I'll throw out some lobs at you first. So it was a psychophys study
Okay.
with an outcome measure that was an economic game. It was either a ultimatum game, I believe. I think it was the ultimatum game, and we were interested in people's anger, moral outrage, and how that would impact their giving to an unrelated other person.
I remember now.
Is it coming back?
Yes. I think that we were inducing anger by giving them really harsh feedback on some sort of essay.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Do you remember what we asked them to write?
I don't remember what we asked them to write, but I remember the feedback was very unkind.
Yeah, so our manipulation was, I guess we probably just had two groups. Our control condition was like decent average feedback, or our one condition was decent average feedback. I think a 7.5 or 8 out of 10. And
Yeah.
then in order to induce anger in our other experimental group was like a 3 out of 10, and we just like ripped them apart and made them like feel like shit. and then hooked them up to measure their heart rate and all these things. So, and the topic of the essay was should humans eat consume meat, or should we all be vegetarians? That was the essay, if I remember
Okay.
correctly.
I don't remember that part, but I'll take your word for it.
Yeah, and
Did
then
you get any results from that? Like
yeah.
what was the outcome? I
No,
don't.
no, it was an absolute mess from what I remember. So we had 3 types of data. We had the psychophys data to see, like, okay, first of all, are people who are primed with this negative feedback, who are made to feel more angry, do they have higher heart rates and skin sweating and these sorts of
Mhm.
physiological reactivity? And then the second was actual just self-report emotion and affect. Do they report being more angry? And then the third was a behavioral measure of, okay, are they, as a result of being and feeling more angry, are they then going to be more selfish in their giving?
Mhm.
So I think obviously they said they're more angry. Good. Psychophys was all over the friggin' map. That's probably because we were hooking up the electrodes wrong or something like that.
You're really ruining my credibility as a scientist here. You
Yeah,
realize that,
just
right?
as a peripheral psychophysiologist. But good thing we don't have to do that in our client work now.
That's true.
If clients or workplaces are listening. So anyways, all that study, and I think nothing really came of it, which is a common thing in academia. I think the number of studies that I ran versus the number of that actually ended up in a paper, let
Yeah.
alone published. Not many, right? So,
I'm always surprised when studies actually work out. Like
right.
when I know that that sounds like a horrible thing to say, but it's almost there's like it sounds magical to me when you get like you have this hypothesis and then it works
Hmm.
out, unless it's like super obvious, in which case it's not very interesting. But
Hmm.
anyway, I digress.
No, but no, it's actually that's come up a number of times on the show where in academia, a lot of people, a lot of researchers are chasing after a p-value of less than 0.05, right? Chasing after the significant effect because they know that's the least publishable unit. They know with that p less than 0.05, they can actually get a publication. And as we know, publications are currency for getting jobs, getting tenure, etc. But in practice, some practitioners in our network have said they actually expect it to not work every time. And so when it does work, it's like, this is great. Look. And I mean, it depends on whether it's like sort of a low hanging fruit question. But
Yeah.
I sense there is this difference. I know that the stakes are still high in practice because you have, you know, people you have to share findings with. You have clients, you have bosses that need convincing to get buy-in and all these sorts of things. But it's a different incentive structure than in academia, where you just need a significant effect to get a publication, and the
100.
psychology behind it's very different.
And I think that, the key difference also is that if you don't get that significance of like P less than 0.05, that doesn't mean that there isn't insight to glean from the data. But
Mm-hmm.
when you're publishing a paper that you're essentially submitting out of your own free will, it's a completely different, type of evaluation that's going on. And so you need to have that statistical significance to even make it through the door. Whereas if a client hires you to do some work for them, they are interested in any insight that you have to give them. So you can still derive something meaningful, even if you don't have that statistically significant correlation for the or whatever it is for that main variable. Like there's still insight to be gleaned.
Yeah, and this is funny, that came up. I had a lunch yesterday with a colleague, and this exact conversation and question came up, and I was of this exact same mindset of you, that even a null result or a negative effect, so-called negative effect,
Yeah.
that there's insight to be gathered there. It's like, well, at least you now know this. And this person I was at lunch with actually was very much disagreed with it. They think that, I guess, that this they were being a bit skeptical, where the same emphasis on positive results that you see in academia and research, the P of less than 0.05 to get a publication, that same sort of obsession or emphasis on a significant effect in practice and industry is also still there, because these stakeholders are investing time and money into these little interventions or experiments that we're running. And so some people are turning around and going, yeah, well, here's your little hypothesis, your pet theory. It better work out because I've actually committed some time and resources and money. So maybe it depends on the industry. Maybe it depends on the type of question that's being asked. But I hope there's not that. I hope it's not too much of that's actually out there. Have you found?
I haven't personally experienced a lot of that. I mean, one thing to keep in mind is that this P that's smaller than 0.05 is very much an academic concept. When you talk to a lot of clients about it, and this is one of the things that I had to learn when making the transition, they don't care. And I know that a lot of, science, like behavioral scientists say, well, we should make it, our job to make them care. And sometimes that's realistic and other times it isn't, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think the key thing is that when you're doing a project and, there is a quantitative component to it, first of all, you never want to just measure one thing, right? So you can measure a number of different things, and you can look at associations between a number of different things to provide insight into, the larger problem that they're looking to solve. So I would say that if you're doing, a big study for a client and you only have one statistical test that you're running, that your entire project is basically balancing on, that is not a very good strategic move, because
Right.
if it doesn't work out, then all you have to say is that it didn't work out and you don't know why. Right. So there always has to be a little bit more to it than that. So that's sort of how I've dealt with it in the past. I've also done a lot of qualitative research, which is surprisingly, well, it's not surprising to me anymore because I've been doing it for a number of years now. But when I first started doing it, I was like, qualitative research, that's ridiculous. Why would anybody do qualitative research with an N of 15 people? But I actually gained a really deep appreciation for it. There's really something to be said for having those face-to-face conversations with people. And so I've been doing a lot of that recently, and applying a behavioral science lens to the types of things that you hear in those conversations. And that's really been impactful for clients as well. So,
And I think not so long ago, like 2 or 3 years ago, there was, from some folks in industry and in the market, that if you're doing behavioral science or if you're doing behavioral economics, you're doing science, which means you're doing the quantitative, the experimental, the randomized controlled trial, you're collecting data, you're running statistical analyses, et cetera, sort of what you see in a psychology or behavioral cognitive science laboratory.
Mhm.
And there was this impression that if you're doing anything less than that, like even the words I'm using is exposing my bias, like qualitative work that other social sciences use all the time, like anthropology or sociology, also who are these experts in human behavior and human nature, that you're not doing as good a job. And that's changed. I've noticed a change in that just within the last year, where I
Yeah.
talk to behavioral scientists in many different roles and business units and industries, and they are doing qualitative type ethnographic work themselves, or they're working with, say, a designer or an anthropologist, which is great. I mean, it's so obvious. It's like, why are we the behavioral scientists with our own specific training? Why are we the special ones that have like better insight into how humans behave or how they think or feel? There's many ways to approach these questions and these phenomena. So I know you've had that experience at Idea Couture, which seemed to be a great place to start just out of PhD, because you were exposed to, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but they do have sort of an array of different talent and people with different backgrounds, like anthropologists and designers.
Yeah.
So how did you actually find that working with them, on client work? And now for a short breather. This is the part of the show where I tell you, lovely listeners of mine, how you can contact me and the show team. All episodes can be found on your usual podcast listening platforms, as well on the website www.behaviorist.biz/BS podcast. That is the American spelling with no U. If you know someone who you think would like the show or find it interesting, please share away and help spread the love. Remember to subscribe on iTunes Podcast or wherever else you get your podcast fix. And one last favor, if I may. You made it this far in this episode, so I can assume you're at least half interested in the BS podcast. Maybe you love the show, hate the host's voice, or vice versa. Anyways, getting honest reviews and ratings is the best way to bring the podcast and applied behavioral science to the masses. So please, I welcome any and all ratings and reviews. Finally, one quick note, BS in the news. Just last week, Radu and Raluca Jadel released what's called Brainy Tab. It's a very cool bookmarks manager and tab browser extension. What it does is every time you open a new tab, it shows you a snippet of information, specifically the name and explanation of a heuristic, cognitive bias, mental model, or dark pattern that you ought to know about in order to improve your decision-making and online behavior. Check it out. You can find it at brainytab.com. All right, back to the show and the super knowledgeable Rimma Teper.
So it was a really interesting experience. And I always said that Idea Couture was the perfect place to go after graduate school, because I think that if I went to a big corporate company right after graduate school, that transition would have been, I'm not saying it would have been bad, but it would have been a very stark contrast.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Idea Couture was like academia, but in a company. It was a bunch of, hipsters with tattoos and like dressing casually and like big ideas and like abstract thinking. So I kind of felt, in a lot of ways, I felt very much at home. And and like their whole mandate was to hire PhD anthropologists, and that was the way that they marketed themselves. That we have the highest number of PhD anthropologists in North America.
Really?
Yeah,
Really? I
and
didn't know
they did. Yeah, so it was a pretty big deal. And it was really great to have all of that experience working with people, from a really multidisciplinary background. So they had anthropologists, they had design research, they had strategists, just like typical like MBA people. So really an array of talents. So from one perspective, it was amazing because I was exposed to all of these different ways of thinking at once. And, there was a very steep learning curve, of course, because just even learning how the business world operates and all of this lingo and jargon that you're not familiar with was difficult in that sense. But really, I felt like I learned so much. Like I really just kind of dove in head first and learned a lot. The one difficulty that I would say, and you sort of started alluding to this in terms of the biases that we have based on the way that we were trained, was that when I first came in, and you imagine that, I'm the only behavioral scientist that comes into the insights practice, as they then called it, among a sea of anthropologists. And a lot of them didn't really know, and I don't blame them, what a behavioral scientist was. And when they positioned me as somebody who was going to be doing quantitative research or, surveys or whatever, they were like, oh my God, that is BS, right? No pun intended. Like, we're going to be reducing people to numbers. Like, that's not human centric. And what can you really learn by doing a survey? Like, you need to talk to people and get the richness of the human experience and whatnot. So there was, some pushback that I had to deal with, and really help people understand the value that behavioral science brings, and that it's not just numbers, that there's psychological theory behind it. There's decades of research and investigation. So it's a discipline in and of itself. But, I came with my own bias too, obviously. Like you said, or like I said, rather, a few minutes ago, like, oh, you're talking to, 20 people or 15 people, and then you're giving a client recommendations based on that. Like, that's ridiculous, right? But I learned that, I learned to work together with these anthropologists, and, they learned to work with me. And at the end of the day, the best projects, in my opinion, that we did were the ones that were multidisciplinary in nature, that had both, the qualitative research, the ethnography, and then the quantitative and behavioral science, because that allows you to provide the client with both the breadth and the depth. Right. So you're able to cover, a large statistically significant sample size, but you're also able to have those really deep and meaningful conversations. And we would typically do the qual before the quant. So we would go into the quant knowing what we wanted to test and had some really deep and meaningful hypotheses, because we actually talked to people face to face. And then, of course, the quantitative data would be interpreted through a behavioral science lens. So if we found correlations or, patterns or trends in the data, I would use theories from social psychology and behavioral science to help understand what those might mean. And those were the best projects because they really combined the best of both worlds.
Yeah, I totally agree. But if you asked me that at the end of my PhD or just freshly out of it, then I would have scoffed at an N of 15 in a focus group. Like you said.
100%.
And it's funny that we have our biases and they, it's very, very like us versus them. They have their biases, but it's the perennial debate within the social human sciences of, say the anthropologist versus the psychologist, the internal, the internal validity versus external validity. We criticize them for having such poor internal validity because they're going out into the, and sorry, I'm going to adopt this mindset. They go out into the world and they're looking at, human behavior in the wild in these ethnographies. But how do they actually know what's going on? They have no idea of actual mechanism or process because they can't isolate the number of confounding or extraneous variables that are floating around in a very complex social dynamic of people living together in a group or operating in a team or whatever it might be. Right. And they come back at us and say, oh, you pride yourselves, psychologists as having high internal validity, but your external validity is awful. What sort of insights can you glean from taking undergraduates into a laboratory environment, sitting them in front of a computer and then claiming stuff about human universals? So we're like saying the same thing. Yeah. And this has been a debate for all of the 20th century now, in the last 20 years of this century, that's I don't think is going away. And the reason, this is just a pet theory of mine, the reason I think that is because academia is so siloed. It's very rare that you have psychologists working, close with anthropologists. We have our own journals. We have our own conferences. Yeah. We have our own language. We have our own way. Just everything is it's a different culture. Whereas in industry, when you go into an organization like Idea Couture, in this case, you're working beside, or at the same desk as an anthropologist, and you're on the same client projects, and you're actually trying to pull together like the bigger patterns, like you say, to get the depth and the breadth. Yeah. So I think, and I suspect you're in agreement with me, we're bound to learn much more about humans and human behavior if we like the consilience, the coming together in this multidisciplinary way that is just, you don't, the infrastructure isn't there in universities or research institutions to get that same effect. You agree?
I agree. I couldn't agree more. Um, I think the more perspectives that you bring to the table, the better it is. The better, like the more nuanced the solution is going to be, the rich the insights are going to be, because you're looking at it from a number of different perspectives. And look, I mean, it's not always easy, because there are going to be times where, a psychologist might see one thing and the anthropologist might say, no, I don't agree with you. What I'm seeing here is something different. But that kind of constructive conflict, that's what produces the highest quality work at the end of
Mm-hmm.
the day.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Good. Well, I'm glad we agreed on that. But it's true, and this actually came. So I'll ask a question. This came up in conversation a couple of days ago with another colleague of mine, and if you had to choose, so the question is, if you had to choose, sort of one or the other, would you opt for higher internal validity or higher external validity?
Oh my God, is this a would you rather
Yeah,
situation?
yeah, a very nerdy would you rather version.
It really, I think it depends on what the challenge that I'm trying to solve is. Okay.
That's a good point.
And
Yeah.
I'll position it this way. So if you are really early on in the research trajectory, where you're, for example, trying to develop a product or a service, or you're just trying to figure out what do people want, what do they need, what motivates them, on a broader level, I would say that absolutely external validity is more important, because you're
Mm-hmm.
never going to find that out through a survey. You need to be there. You need to watch them, interact with their environment. You need to see the context that they live in, and have those conversations and understand what they mean and what they want. I
Mm-hmm.
think that when we're talking about the type of work that behavioral scientists traditionally do, so randomized control trials, or A/B testing as it's called in the business world,
Mm-hmm.
that is an incredibly useful tool for when you've already designed a product or a solution or a brand message or a communication of some sort, and you want to test, you know, various iterations of that, right? You want to understand which one is going to work better and why, right? So if I change the messaging, to reflect, this human need, are people going to be more responsive to it? Then, yeah, that needs to be done on a quantitative level. I don't think it really makes sense to go and have an interview with somebody or a focus group to discern that, because you're going to get different opinions. And in the end of the day, it's going to be, just a puddle of muddle. Is that a
Yeah.
thing? Do people say that?
I
I don't
like.
think so. Puddle of muddle. So really, and that's how I used to position it to clients and the teams that I worked on, both at Idea Couture and in Research Strategy Group. There are different projects have different research needs,
Mm.
and of course, they can benefit from both. But if you have to choose between one or the other, and you're more in an exploratory phase, then yeah, go out there and talk to people, watch them, make breakfast at home, or watch them, I don't know, do their hair if you're like a hair company.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
have to be there to really understand what the gaps are.
Yeah.
Then once you've already, you're further down the research trajectory, and you're trying to figure out, how to tweak it to make it perfect to get that MVP, that's when the quantitative side of things comes in.
I like the distinction. That's actually great. I was actually hoping to just get you for you to give me one answer and then move on, but
Sorry.
I much prefer your response, which is it's nuanced and it's subtle, and that subtlety is it depends on where in the question asking you are. If it's like you said, it's sort of this distinction between exploratory and confirmatory. So if you're at the beginning stages of just wondering what, then you needed to go out and observe. And then if you need to confirm or test those predictions and maybe ask questions about mechanism or process, then you can do a randomized control trial. But I actually like that idea. So then do you think then that the qualitative, the focus groups, the ethnographies, just going out and observing, would you categorize that under behavioral science? or is that something else? Or does it even matter?
Well, I think that and this is another debate that I used to have with my colleagues, is that we're making this distinction and we're confounding um, the theoretical principle and the methodology. So if we're talking about, maybe behavioral science is unique in that, it is all about experimentation and randomized control trials. But if we take a field like psychology more broadly, that is a discipline. It's not a methodology. There are many different types of way to do psychological research, right? So there is
Mm-hmm.
qualitative psychology as well. So remind me what your question was. Where am I going with this?
Yeah, I just that if you're doing qualitative work,
Oh,
are you considered a behavioral scientist? Which you're saying you're using, and I've talked about this again and again. You're using the term psychologist, and yes, there are qualitative psychologists, and they're doing great work in their own right. But I guess because of the branding of our field of
yeah.
what was started with BE, and now it's sort of undergoing a change in name. The science part seems to be important to some, and so the question is, do we need to to what extent do we need to defend the science part, the quantitative, the experimentation, the those sorts of things that are striving for methodological rigor? Or can we just get by with doing qualitative in combination and call ourselves something else?
I mean, that's a great question. And I'm not sure I have a definitive answer for you, because I would say that as long, like what I do a lot, like in my past job and a little bit of what I'm doing now, there's quant involved, of course, but a lot of what I do is apply behavioral science theory to qualitative research and actually help clients craft strategies with
Mm,
behavioral science principles in mind. And I know that
mm,
I'm not the only one out there that's doing that. And so maybe a better title for this position would be something like a behavioral strategist.
mm,
Uh, but at the end of the day, when I go into to do qualitative research, whether it be an ethnography or a focus group or an in-depth interview, I'm putting on my behavioral science hat, and I'm sifting through the data eventually and listening to what people are saying. And in my mind, I have these little light bulb moments where I'm like, that's loss aversion. Okay, that's the status quo bias. And
mhm,
over, multiple interviews, these patterns start to emerge. So is it a scientific process, in the traditional sense of the word? Probably not. But
mhm,
I'm applying the science to a different type of methodology. And so, it it's a good question, I think, because we're not a regulated field, right? So it's not like if you call yourself a psychologist, you have to, have, these hours of training and you have to pass this exam. So we don't have the same thing that if you're a behavioral scientist, you have to do statistical analyses.
mhm, mhm,
Maybe we should. I'm not sure. But I think that when you're taking it into industry and you're making it a more applied practice, with that comes more flexibility in terms of you need to do what's going to add value to the client,
mhm, mhm. Whatever that is.
whatever that
Good,
is.
good. I like that. Okay, to maybe just a slight pivot. So you're in this new role. Just what, like 2 months? Very, very new, right?
Not even 2 months. On the
Not
12th,
even.
it's going to be 2 months. I joined on November 12th.
So you're probably still drinking from the fire hose. But at this very early stages, what are you most excited about with the with this role? Because it seems like a bit of it's obviously still in the category of behavioral science, and but it seems like a slightly different role from what you've been doing in the past. So yeah, what are you excited about, and what's sort of coming up of any projects you can or are willing to share?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot to be excited about, primarily because this role is a role that was in the process of being created while they were talking to me. And so what that means is that I have some say into what I bring to the role, which is always exciting, because it kind of sucks when you start a job and they're like, okay, we want you to do X, Y, and Z. Here are your roles and responsibilities.
Hmm.
Go and, fill in the blanks. And so this role is very much the opposite of that. So, of course, there's a mandate for my role that's been designed by my boss and, with some input from me. But at the end of the day, I have a lot of creative freedom in terms of where I think I can add value. And so because internal audit, if you know anything about internal audit, it's not a very, it's not a role that you would traditionally think a behavioral scientist would be working in.
Hmm.
So there's a lot of uncharted territory. Um, and so what I hope to do in this role and what I'm excited most for is really bringing a new level of understanding to the audits and reviews that we do. So we go out into various aspects of the enterprise and we're supposed to, give our clients insights about, issues that they have pertaining to risk and conduct and compliance. And when you say those things, it's all a matter of decision making and behavior, right? So when
Hmm.
these are people that are making decisions, these are people that are behaving in a certain way. And I get to bring a completely different lens to the insights rather than saying that, okay, this control is not in place or this control is in place. I get to go a little bit deeper and bring value to our clients by explaining that there are these systematic forces that influence decision making that most people aren't even aware of, and they operate on a subconscious level. And here are some ways that we can actually tweak decision making in the desired direction, right?
Hmm.
So that's something that is very new for the department, and I'm really excited to help people see the value of that. And also from a methodological perspective, bringing in some of that qualitative and then quantitative research, building surveys that are, statistically reliable, all of
Hmm.
that. So there's so much to do. So my role is really like I'm putting on many, many hats throughout the day. I'm having meetings with many, many people. And so it's really exciting and really dynamic. Um, yeah, it's,
And your client, just to clarify, and this is for my own, because it's
yeah,
probably an obvious point, but when you say your clients, those are people within RBC with
yes,
different business units and functions.
yes, exactly.
Gotcha,
Yeah.
gotcha. Well, that's exciting. It sounds almost like entrepreneurial, or what some people might say intrapreneurial within a very very big organization,
Yeah.
RBC. That yeah, like you have the freedom and the autonomy to explore, and to try out new things. It sounds very exciting.
It is very exciting. And, our team is an exciting team to work for because we're trying to reimagine what audit can look like. And we're trying to
Mm,
move away from like the traditional, stereotype that's associated with auditors and actually be strategic partners to our clients and really add value. And so we're thinking about things in different ways. So, bringing a behavioral scientist on board is part of that vision. We have data scientists and advanced analytics that are helping with that. So it's really, a really great team to be working for because they're really future focused, outside of the box thinkers, and yeah, the potential is really great.
I guess a question I had was, okay, here we go. You were again, as I mentioned at the beginning, I always sort of admired you for your work, and you were always very compelling, and you communicated clearly, you wrote clearly. A lot of PhDs are, although they're smart, they are very confusing in when they talk about things. You were not that. So you had a lot of publications. You were quite prolific in publishing. So, what would you say is your favorite publication of yours, or your line of work? And which would you say is the most relevant for an applied context? And I'm curious to see if those are different or the same.
Ooh, that's a good question. I think my favorite, and this might not be for any logical reason aside from the fact that it was like my first big win. And also just in my mind, like it was one of those studies where it took a lot of time to run, and it was because it was a psychophysiology study. And we had this hypothesis that I was convinced was right. And it actually, everything just like came out right. The psychophys data came out the way that we expected, the behavioral data, and then it got published in Psych Science, which, as you know, was like for a graduate student was a
Hmm.
really big deal. So it's that moral forecasting paper from
Hmm.
2011, which, oh my gosh, is 9 years ago. And I just remember like that was for me like it was such a level of excitement. I think, yeah, part of the reason because it was a psych science and it was a really big deal, but also because I really loved and believed in that study. And
Mhm.
so that's
For
probably my
listeners, can you give the 30-second abstract?
Yeah, sure. So basically, what I spent almost my entire PhD studying is the dissociation between what people think they're going to do in a moral dilemma, which we called moral forecasting, versus what they actually do in a moral dilemma. So we had numerous experiments, throughout those, 5 or 6 years that I spent in graduate school that showed that people actually sometimes underestimate their likelihood to act morally. And what that means in practical terms was that if you ask people, for example, how many times out of 15 would they cheat on a math test for monetary gain, they might say something like 4 or 5 times, like 4 or 5 questions out of 15. And then you actually put them in that situation and nobody cheats, barely. So the average is like 1 out of 15 questions
Mm.
in a sample of individuals. And so when we started this work, we first of all thought that the effect was going to go in the opposite direction, as many people would. So we were quite surprised to see this, this rosy picture of humanity before us, where people
Mm.
are actually more moral than they think they are. And so we were forced to think about this is way more than 30 seconds, I realize
Yeah,
now.
that's all right.
Like, here's my entire dissertation. So we realized that we had to figure out why this was the case, and my hypothesis essentially was that when you put people in a moral dilemma, when they're actually faced with a moral dilemma, there's an emotional response that comes along with that. Your body reacts in a certain way. You might be nervous, you might be anxious, etc. And
Mm.
when you ask people to predict their behavior in the abstract, they're not going to be very emotional. And so perhaps it's that emotional response, that fast heart rate, or that, those sweaty palms. Maybe that has something to do with the fact that you're not cheating very much on this test. And that's
Mm.
exactly what we found in this paper, was that people who were in the moral dilemma had a heightened physiological response. Those who were simply forecasting their behavior had a lower physiological response. And that's what accounted for that difference.
Mm.
So that's probably that would be my favorite paper.
Hmm.
Um,
And then
in
most relevant.
most relevant to what kind of work, though? Because I would say that right now, having just made this transition to RBC, where
Hmm.
some of the key topics that we're looking at are things like misconduct and compliance, and it's essentially ethical decision making in a
Hmm.
lot of ways. So I would say that
Hmm.
perhaps that paper might be the most applicable to that, because it investigates moral decision making. um,
Well, that's a
and I
good
think
answer then, because you have both interest and relevance. Checks off
Yeah,
both.
and I think the other thing that's interesting about that paper is the whole forecasting piece, where you ask people to predict their behavior, you ask people to report on their behavior in the abstract, which surveys do all the time. Market research does that all the time, and I think it just goes to show that it's not necessarily a reflection of reality, and
Hmm.
that you have to keep that in mind when interpreting that data, taking it with a grain of salt, understanding that in the real world there are emotional reactions that shape our behavior that aren't present in the abstract and in the hypothetical.
You're right. I've actually never thought of it in that way, in that context, where in so many different situations we come in, whether it's internally within the organization we work in or with on client work, we strategize and we come up with and we collect data and we come up with ideas, but often the recommendations and the considerations are in this abstract hypothetical scenario, this world, and the implementation isn't in the day to day. And I think, we would do, it would be wise for us to heed the advice that when you ask people to think about or imagine, that's a totally different psychology than being in the actual situation itself.
Yep,
That's
that's for
great.
sure.
I like that. I never thought of it that way. Okay, one more question for you, if you don't mind. I call this the big behavioral brainstorm, or the BBB. So as we know, gosh, it seems more than ever these days, the world is basically a mess. It's on fire, and there's a lot of problems, and a lot of problems need solutions. And so, given that, what would you say is the one that needs the most fixing, that we could use or apply a behavioral science lens?
So the biggest problem, or the one that lends itself best to behavioral science?
You're good. You're really calling me out on my shit here.
No, I'm just buying time because I don't know how to answer this question. I'm stalling.
Let's say either one. But it's a good distinction.
I would say that, gosh, I really don't know. So this is what I'll say, and this might sound really bad, because I think that some of the biggest problems that we have in terms of, talking about things like, some of the political stuff that's going on in the world right now, it stems from people's values and people's beliefs about the world that tend to come imbued with a lot of emotion, right? So if you have a political stance on something, it's likely that you feel pretty strongly about it, and it's really an emotionally hot topic. I would say that it's possible to sway people and to change them. I'm not saying it's not possible, but I think that when topics like this are imbued so heavily with that emotional flavor, it's much more difficult to actually shift behavior. I would say that go for the lowest hanging fruit. Go for those really easy ones, because there are a lot of problems in the world that can be fixed quite easily that people don't feel so emotional about, through things like nudges in behavioral science. And of course, everybody says that if you talk to a behavioral scientist, the first thing that they're going to tell you about is the organ donation study, which is absolutely true. I talk about that every single time when I first meet somebody. But it's because it's such a brilliant, example of something that of a behavior that's so consequential that you can change, pretty easily by changing the way that a form is designed, for a topic that people aren't really going to debate over, right? So I would say go for those easy wins, those lowest hanging fruit that don't really require you to change people's minds, but just change people's behaviors. Because it's a lot easier to change somebody's behavior than it is to change somebody's mind.
Yeah, that's a good point. And now that you're saying this, I might actually have to revise the way that I asked this question, because it's conflating a few things. As you pointed out, it's like, okay, what can we actually, like, what's in the realm of being possible to change? What's sort of that low hanging fruit, versus the things that really we need fixing somehow. But maybe then, and I'm just thinking, playing devil's advocate on myself here, maybe those big issues don't require a behavioral approach. Maybe it's, some non-behavioral systemic thing that we behavioral scientists should just butt out and not try and deal with, leave it to the politicians and the policymakers.
Yeah. I mean, I really don't know. I mean, it's a great question. It's really something to think about. I mean, I always say that when human decision making is involved, there's a place for behavioral science. And to some extent, I do think that that's true, but we can't fix all of the problems at once. And I think that if you're going to try to go for the most impact to show where we can add value, I would start with those things that are consequential and that, that can be changed rather easily, but that still have an impact.
Yeah, that's good. Love it. Perfect. Well, thank you. Thanks for coming. It's been great to catch up and to reminisce and to go back in time in our PhD and talk about all of our failed studies. So really, really appreciate you coming on, and best of luck in the new role.
Thank you very much. This was lovely and lots of fun. Wishing you luck as well with future podcasts and future BS.
Cheers. Yeah. Thanks so much, Rimma. Okay, talk later.
Okay, thanks.
Hey, Nick here once more. A final farewell note before ending. All the show notes, links to papers, resources, and materials mentioned in the episode can be found on the BS podcast page of The Behaviorist, where you can find all episodes and lots of other interesting, easy-to-apply, sciencey stuff. Just go to www.behaviorist.biz/BS podcast. And lastly, if you'd like to join me in the mission of spreading the good BS word, remember to rate and review the show on iTunes. Why should you? Because 1, you're a part of a digital-wide social proof exercise. 2, you're helping combat the negativity bias in the form of positive reviews. And 3, it's a little pre-commitment for your habitual podcast listening. A little investment to keep you coming back for more BS. I mean, how much more behavioral can you get? Thanks again for listening. Until next time, remember, keep your facts ugly and your hypotheses beautiful.